Hello, everyone. I'm Marshall. I'm the author of Dead End Guildmaster, free on Royal Road. If you're reading that, thank you for the support. So every week I do a little video on the writing process and ways to improve your writing, or if you're not a writer, just an avid reader, give you another way to appreciate the craft of writing that you're ingesting as you're reading your favorite stories. So today, this is a common topic, active versus passive voice. You probably heard about this way back in your English class, but it's still one of the most common opportunities that writers have for making their writing more interesting and more engaging because it's so easy to miss and because there's a little bit of confusion sometimes about when to actually use passive voice, when passive voice is the better choice than active. And that confusion can trip some writers up. So let's dive into it. So passive voice is what we see here when we have was writing. So basically we have an extra verb here that takes us farther into the past than we really need to be. So the quick adjustment to this sentence is, he rode his bike across town. And already we can see how this is a bit more interesting. It's definitely leaner. It's more succinct. It's more efficient. But the important thing to me, and you'll hear me talk about this a lot in my videos if this is your first one, is that we want the subject and the verb to be as close together as possible, because this verb is really what's going to keep our writing alive and keep it moving forward. It's all about action, basically, right? So if we need to, if we put distance between our verbs, we're actually putting distance between our reader and action. So this is the easiest trick, easiest way to remember this is if there's the word was in front of another verb, you can probably change it to active. And this is going to make most of your writing immediately more interesting and more impactful if you just make this quick change. That said, there are reasons when we might want to use passive voice, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But for the revision side of things, for how you find this more efficiently, always look for constructions that put the word was in front of the verb. We just talked about that. Sometimes it's helpful to think about bringing the verb farther forward, depending on the way you think about your writing and the way you think about communication. Sometimes that visual can help. The other thing you might need to be on the lookout for is that a lot of times passive voice will kind of flip the sentence structure, where the real subject is kind of buried. So if we look at this sentence, Henry was eaten by the crocodile. We have this passive construction, was eaten. But if I revise this to Henry ate, that doesn't make sense. So we fix this part, but the rest of the sentence doesn't align. Because one of the things that'll happen with the passive voice is the real subject, aka the noun that's actually performing the verb, is buried deeper in the sentence. So that makes it a little bit trickier to revise. So typically, we're going to have to flip the sentence construction. So this becomes, the crocodile ate Henry. So the crocodile was really the one that was doing the eating. So we try to bring that noun closer to the verb again to make this sentence easier to understand, but also a bit more exciting, because this is to me, this is punchier. This gets us to the action. It gets us to the meat of what's happening here to Henry. So, like I was saying, this gets confusing because I think there's a lot of writers that use passive and active voice unconsciously, where it's just easier to write in passive voice. So a lot of times passive voice comes out in your drafts, which is totally fine. But there's also a part of this where writers are using the passive voice with an intention of controlling how distant the action was. And I want to talk about that a little bit because it matters. And there is a point where sometimes passive voice is going to be useful. Not very often, but let's talk about why this confusion might exist. So if we take an idea and we look at it in a couple different constructions and a couple different word arrangements here, we're going to look at how far away from the present moment the verbs take us. So a lot of times when somebody writes, he was riding his bike, they're trying to make it as close to the present as possible. Because usually they're trying to go for something like, he was riding his bike when the goose hit him. I don't know why I'm obsessed with goose violence, but it comes up a lot in my in my writing and in my life. This takes us very close to the present moment. We're trying to connect these two incidents closely together. And that's oftentimes what we think we're doing when we're using that construction. He was riding his bike. We think we're bringing it closer to the present than we really are. So we typically want he rode his bike. And then if we want that action to be farther away, we use had been riding his bike. Now, this matters when we have a paragraph or we have a scene where there's multiple variables that have happened at different points in time. So he had been riding his bike is a piece of information that might be relevant to a scene, but it's not relevant to the immediate action. So the way I look at this is majority of the time I want to use the active voice. He rode his bike. This is going to be the more interesting sentence construction 99% of the scenes that you create. I might use he was riding his bike when, like we were talking about before. This setup here is more important because we want to establish that these two things happened at the same time. That has to be a really, really, really important detail in the story because he was riding his bike when he hit the car. Because this could be and hit a car. Very similar ideas, but not exactly the same. Again, the majority of the time, I want this active version, but I might want to zoom out just a little bit to de-emphasize the bike section and more emphasize that these happen simultaneously. There would have to be a good reason for us to do that, but if we have one, let's use it. And then if we want to really make this distance, we use had been riding his bike. This is something that's happened way in the past from the scene that we're discussing. Background information, not as critical, but this can also be a useful construction in some cases. Again, vast majority of the time, you want to go with active voice. So some quick tips. It's all about the verbs. Always look for the verbs. Verbs are going to be a core part of making your writing engaging, bringing your writing to life, bringing scenes to life, really putting readers in the action. All comes down to verbs. That said, don't beat yourself up too much about active versus passive voice when you're drafting. Look at this as a revision opportunity. If you worry too much about it when you're first putting words on paper or words into your Google Doc, it can really slow you down and it can impede your ability to put your story together originally. So I would say don't worry about it in the drafting, worry about it in revision because it's a relatively easy fix. So don't let an easy fix turn into a giant stumbling block when you're first putting your story together. Again, active voice is going to be better the vast majority of the time. And that's just going to be the nature of the writing. And sometimes you'll read a sentence and you'll disagree with yourself that it would be better as active. But as soon as you revise it, you'll find that that is the case. So just trust me on that one. And then if this is something that's really present in your writing, it's a common habit that you have, just straight up Control F the word was and go sentence by sentence to see if there's constructions that you can make active that are currently passive. This is one of those pieces of writing that can become invisible to you because it can become so natural and you're so used to putting sentences together this way that your mind doesn't even realize that you're using passive voice, even if you're looking for it. And this little trick can help. So I hope that was interesting for you, and I hope that gives you some ideas for what you can do with your writing and how you can improve your drafting and your revision process. Thanks for joining, and I hope to see you again next week.